The crisis is now in its fourth year, and everyone agrees that it's all about one thing: jobs. Obama has declared that jobs will be the #1 priority for the rest of his term. That is the decisive electoral issue. It's the standard according to which people should judge the government's performance. Economic experts of all stripes debate the effectiveness of 2 stimulus packages in terms of job creation, and offer various competing models for reducing unemployment. The main players in the economy, business, always complains about the difficulties it faces in its efforts to create jobs: tight credit, tax burdens, overly regulated labor markets, and the new health care reform law, implying its interest in jobs is a service to the people. And finally, for the majority of the population, of course, everything revolves around jobs as well. While most workers worry quietly about losing their jobs or about their prospects for finding one, others have gone out on the streets with signs reading, "Save our jobs," appealing to the government to do anything it can to save their employers. In short, all sides seem to agree that employment is the yardstick for measuring the health of the economy and the well-being of the population. It is the overriding goal to which everyone is or should be dedicated. That is something everyone takes for granted, even and perhaps especially the left, who criticize government, business, and the overall spirit of neoliberalism for the failure and the lack of efforts to create jobs. But we should step back for a moment and question this seemingly self-evident truism. The cry for jobs is not at all self-evident, but absurd and brutal. And that's not only true when workers say "American jobs for American workers" and other xenophobic slogans. It is more fundamental than that. A society in which work is the ultimate need and desire of workers is one that is hostile to workers. All too many chime in with this call for work. As Karl Marx once wrote, "To be a productive laborer in capitalism is not a piece of luck, but a misfortune." This basic insight is crucial, and it is irreconcilable with the cry for jobs. Work is not a human need. Quote, "The American people need work," unquote. That's a phrase that everybody takes for granted, especially in times of high unemployment. In fact, it doesn't get any more absurd. Nobody needs work. What people need are the products of work. Work is necessary toil for producing useful things. Work is a means to an end, and not an end in itself. So, if the necessities are produced in less time and there is less work to be done, then everyone should be happy, not worried. But in capitalism, things are apparently not that simple. Here there is a shortage of work, not of goods. Nobody is concerned about or claims that there is a shortage of goods, and yet people are poor and getting poorer because of a shortage of work to produce more goods. That is the first, best, and most simple proof that in capitalism, the purpose of work is not to satisfy people's needs. Apparently, it serves a different purpose, and everybody knows what that purpose is: profit. For profit, there can never be enough work. The more, the better. Could there be a better indicator of the antagonism between the purpose of work and those who have to do that work? And yet, because profit is the purpose of work, any work that is not useful for profit doesn't get done. So, the livelihoods of those whose work isn't useful for profit are superfluous. This is yet another indicator of how little work in this society is a means for the people. The truth is that people depend on work because they need the wages work pays. Otherwise they remain excluded from the goods that exist in abundance, but that are the private property of those that have the goods produced for the sake of their profit. So, the brutality of this society does not begin when people need work and can't find any. It begins when they have this need for work in the first place. All the problems they have finding work are a guaranteed result of this absurd need for work, and always more work. Workers can't create any jobs. Workers might be able to work, they might say they want to work, and in capitalism they certainly have to work. but they are unable to work on their own power, on the basis of their own need for goods. After all, the means of production are the private property of someone else. Workers are mere labor power, a mere possibility of employment. They are completely powerless to turn this possibility into a reality. They can't just decide they will work and then go do it. They can't simply go to the factory and start producing goods. That's why they demand work, because they are dependent on somebody else giving it to them. Clearly, work isn't their means. It's not something they can control. In order to perform the work they need to do for their own livelihood, they have to prove useful for a different interest, that of the capitalist. The capitalist, as the owner of the means of production, has the freedom to decide whether work is done, and therefore whether workers who need work can earn a livelihood. So, the only thing the workers can do is to demand, or better, plead for work. In short, people can live only if their labor is useful for profit. The reason for this perverse need to find work is their subordination to the interests of capital and its accumulation. Marx's explanation of class society, his condemnation of capitalism, can be summed up in this strange need. Workers are excluded from the means of production, which exists as private property, and therefore find themselves in the dire predicament of needing work, needing to sell the only thing they own in order to survive, their labor power, or their own ability to work. It is harmful to cry for jobs. If anyone still needs more proof of how little work is the means of the workers, then take a look at how the work that is done is organized and the criterion according to which that work gets paid. Not only are most people dependent on their labor power being useful for profit in order to live, the usefulness of their labor power for profit consists in their working as much as possible and earning as little as possible. That's because their work is the source of profit, and because their pay is a deduction from profit. When a business wants work, it wants as much of it as possible, and it wants to pay as little as possible for it, so that its interest, the difference between cost and profit, is as large as possible. Because it is about profit, workers are costs, an entry on the balance sheet no different than any other cost, like energy or machines, so they are squeezed for as much work as possible. So a worker can never say, "Okay, now I have a job, I'm okay." He ruins himself at work, and still has a hard time making ends meet. So a job is an inadequate means of subsistence, to say the least. And it is not only an inadequate means for a livelihood, but when people have a job, it restricts them and harms them. The very way they earn a livelihood is a threat to their health and well-being. The need for jobs expresses an ugly truth about capitalism. People need exploitation in order to live. They are compelled to be interested in making themselves useful for economic interests that succeed at their expense. To say people need jobs is to show how dependent they are. This is an indictment of capitalism, the subordinate position that people are forced into and the role they play in it. So the call for jobs is never addressed to workers. How could it be? Workers don't have any control over jobs. Jobs are not their means. So it is appropriate that the call for jobs is always addressed to business and the state. After all, they are the activists and profiteers of work in this society. Jobs are in the interest of the state and business. On the one hand, when politicians say that job creation is their number one priority, and when businesses talk about their desire to create jobs and the difficulties they have in doing so, they are being dishonest. Jobs are not the goal. Profit is their goal. On the other hand, politicians and businessmen, they might be dishonest, but they have a good reason to call for jobs. That's precisely what their interest is in jobs. Other people's labor is the source of capitalist enrichment and the source of the growth that the state is interested in. In that sense, they really are interested in creating jobs. They say it is difficult to create jobs, but what they really mean is that it is difficult to create the conditions for profitable jobs. That is the measure of whether capitalists are producing wealth that counts. So how do governments and businesses go about improving the conditions for more jobs? Logically, they do this by improving conditions for business, and that involves, above all, increasing the profitability of labor. There are plenty of methods for doing so, but essentially it comes down to having people work longer hours for less pay and with greater flexibility and insecurity. That also demonstrates how jobs aren't a means for people's livelihoods, but the means by which capital enriches itself at the cost of those who perform labor. So for politicians and capitalists, it makes sense to call for jobs, because jobs are the source of their wealth and power. But leftists should not join this call, because again, jobs means being extorted. If leftists call for jobs, they are not addressing workers. After all, this is not something that workers can decide on. All they can do is make their exploitation more attractive, and even then, they are still powerless to create any jobs. Who they do address, whether they like it or not, is business and the state, those who benefit from other people's exploited labor, and also create unemployment in the pursuit of their interest of profit. Leftist wishful thinking. Of course, when those on the left call for job creation, they don't have in mind the profit of capital and the power of the state. They don't say, get rid of unions and no taxes, but prevent outsourcing, and tax the rich, and use the money for schools and healthcare. Right now, green jobs initiatives are particularly popular. But here it is noticeable that in capitalism, even socially desirable things are not produced if there is no prospect for profit. And these projects are realized only, and insofar as the state considers them necessary for capitalist society, and they are financed by the society as a whole. This is something that needs to be criticized instead of asking whether the state could or should do something different than what it always does. Leftists have to explain how subordinate the workers' interests are to those of capital and the state, rather than seeking to reconcile those interests. This never works in capitalism, because this society's purpose is the accumulation of capital, rather than taking care of people's needs. And if the state has to step in to create new industries, like with the Green Jobs Initiative, it is naive to think things will turn out any different. Because what the state will be fostering is new fields of business opportunities, and nobody should be surprised by what this will look like for workers. It will mean low wages, long hours, and bad working conditions. What is so harmful about the call for jobs is that by calling for jobs, leftists affirm the dependency of workers on, and their subordination to, the profits of capital. And this affirmation isn't just an implicit theoretical act. It's not just the premise of the call for jobs. That's why, when it comes to practice, one solution is prominent, and the call for jobs always ends up in disappointment and the complaint that exploitation increases and the workers are worse off. That's something that unions, and especially their members, have been experiencing all over the world. In capitalism, the only way to fight for jobs is to accept and offer sacrifices on the part of those who need jobs, on the part of the workers. In summary, it is a mistake to think that a job is something good because losing a job is something bad. Workers end up offering themselves at reduced, cheaper prices, and begging for jobs undermines the very reason they go to work in the first place, to get a paycheck. Instead, not only should workers take a serious look at their position in this system of exploitation, but a proper critique of capitalism involves telling them about that position instead of affirming it in the call for jobs. The main players in the economy, business, always complains about the difficulties it faces in its efforts to create jobs. Tight credit, tax burdens, overly regulated labor markets, and the new healthcare reform law, implying its interest in jobs is a service to the people. And finally, for the majority of the population, of course, everything revolves around jobs as well. While most workers worry quietly about losing their jobs or about their prospects for finding one, others have gone out on the streets with signs reading, "Save our jobs," appealing to the government to do anything it can to save their employers. In short, All sides seem to agree that employment is the yardstick for measuring the health of the economy and the well-being of the population. It is the overriding goal to which everyone is or should be dedicated. That is something everyone takes for granted, even and perhaps especially the left, who criticize government, business, and the overall spirit of neoliberalism for the failure and the lack of efforts to create jobs. But we should step back for a moment and question this seemingly self-evident truism. The cry for jobs is not at all self-evident, but absurd and brutal. And that's not only true when workers say American jobs for American workers and other xenophobic slogans. It is more fundamental than that. A society in which work is the ultimate need and desire of workers is one that is hostile to workers. All too many chime in with this call for work. As Karl Marx once wrote, to be a productive laborer in capitalism is not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. This basic insight is crucial, and it is irreconcilable with the cry for jobs. Work is not a human need. Quote, the American people need work, unquote. That's a phrase that everybody takes. The crisis is now in its 4th year, and everyone agrees that it's all about one thing, jobs. Obama has declared that jobs will be the #1 priority for the rest of his term. That is the decisive electoral issue. It's the standard according to which people should judge the government's performance. Economic experts of all stripes debate the effectiveness of 2 stimulus packages in terms of job creation, and offer various competing models for reducing unemployment.